About the moon.
About the moon.
Not the stars or the planets or anything. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. It was 55 years ago today that this guy left the moon along with Buzz Aldrin. So July 21st. And I'm going to ask if you remember, where were you on July 20th, 1969? In front of the television, maybe? Watching this? If you were in New York, every station had it except for Channel 9, which was showing a John Wayne movie.
Oh, really? They wouldn't show it?
They didn't show it. Channel 9 didn't show it. $1 million movie.
Interesting.
There is John F. Kennedy, President of the United States. He is speaking here at Rice University in Houston, Texas, and this is what he said that day. We choose to go to the moon and these other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. It was May 25th, 1961 that President Kennedy set a goal. Put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. It was in the middle of the Cold War competition, and Kennedy really wasn't worried about space, didn't like space all that much, but he had this goal in mind: get American man on the moon first, beat the Soviets. He said to a NASA administrator, "I'm not all that interested in space. Everything doesn't mean anything to me except that lunar landing, and it better be an American man first on the moon." Well, Kennedy was assassinated November 22nd, 1963, and the guy on the right is Lyndon Johnson, who was sworn in as president. He's talking to James Webb, who was the head of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And Johnson was interested in space. Kennedy wanted to go to the moon, but if he survived, or if he wasn't shot, and if he was running for re-election, it is doubtful he would have pulled out of Vietnam. He didn't want to upset World War II veterans by leaving Vietnam. He wasn't going to do much about the civil rights movement because he couldn't afford to lose all those votes in the South. And as far as funding the space program, if there were other priorities, that was going to take place. He was not going to fight that one to the end. But Johnson did. And as Walter Cronkite, I knew Howard Cosell. I know his kids or grandkids, Jared, and also Justin and Colin. And let me do a Cosell thing here, since I knew him. He once told me this. When they write the history of TV, they're gonna write about the 3 C's: Cronkite, Cosell, and Carson, and not necessarily in that order. Anyway, Cronkite, who I met twice. Once we talked about him playing amateur hockey in Houston in the 1930s. And another time we talked about tennis, and he played tennis. That was it. We never talked about anything else. But Cronkite referred to the former President Lyndon Johnson as the father of the program, the space program. And no one did more than LBJ to commit the U.S. to landing men on the moon and returning them safely to Earth. And there is Johnson, and this is July the 16th, 1969, and he's at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, and he is watching the rocket, the big rocket, the Saturn V, that would take Americans to the moon. And so he's watching the blast off, and he is waiting to see what happens. Can the rocket get up there and propel them to the moon? And they would. That's Neil Armstrong, and of course they were propelled to the moon. Neil Armstrong talked about the flight shortly after getting out of quarantine, and this is what he said. A month before the launch of Apollo 11, we decided we were confident enough we could try and attempt on the descent to the surface. Thought we had about a 90% chance of getting back safely to Earth. That meant he's telling you there's only a 1 in 10 chance he's going to die. There's a 1 in 10 chance he is going to die. Would you take a job like that where you think, no, there's a 10% possibility I'm going to get killed, all for about $27,000 a year? And getting safely back to Earth on that flight. Not only 50-50 chance of making a landing on the first attempt. So he wasn't even sure that he could land the craft.
I remember all the wives
yeah.
waiting to see
Yeah.
how they were going to make out.
There were so many unknowns on that descent from lunar orbit down to the surface that had not been demonstrated yet by testing, and there was a big chance. There was something in there we didn't understand properly, and we had to abort and come back to Earth without landing. And that's the Apollo 11 crew. That's Neil Armstrong, that's Michael Collins, and obscured in the back is Buzz Aldrin. And this is where I have to thank somebody for helping me out on this talk. And you're going to hear this name throughout the talk. It's my friend Dick Hull, H-O-L-L. Dick worked for NASA between 1960 and 1975. He was part of that mission in Australia. He was taking in video, he was taking in audio, and there's a story that you cannot repeat that I am going to tell you after you tell your friends, your children, your grandchildren, and whoever else you want to tell, but you didn't get the story from me. Anyway, so Dick is an integral part of this talk too, and a lot of the stuff that you got on the space program, Dick told me because he was part of the Gemini program and the Apollo program. When Armstrong and Aldrin, Buzz Aldrin, made their descent aboard the Eagle to the moon's surface, the onboard computer had intended to put them down on the side of a large crater with steep slopes littered with huge boulders. Not a good place to land at all. Now let me ask you a question. How many of you, when you drive, if you drive, how many of you depend on this, your GPS, to get you somewhere? You do, you do. I was once coming back from Binghamton. My son's 39 years old now. And so this is, you're going back about 17, 18 years. More than 18 years, actually. And we're coming back from Binghamton, and I'm taking Route 17 across to Route 6, and I'm trying to figure out, should I go over the Bear Mountain Bridge, or should I go down the Palisades to the Tappan Zee Bridge? Well, GPS put me right in the middle of the Hudson River. Right in the middle of the Hudson River, and they were probably right, because there was no traffic on the Hudson River. Not a good place to land at all, said Armstrong. I took it over manually, flew it like a helicopter out to the west direction, took it to a smoother area without so many rocks and found a level area, and was able to get it down there before the fuel ran out. There was something like 20 seconds of fuel left. Now, I was a news junkie when I was 13 years old. I knew that I was going to go into the radio and TV business, newspaper business, so I was listening intently back on July 20th, 1969. It was WCBS radio, and after Armstrong says tranquility based here, the Eagle has landed, you hear one astronaut, a guy by the name of Charlie Duke, who was on the headsets down at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and he says, you got a lot of boys around here about ready to turn blue. Nobody explained what that meant. What it meant was the lunar craft, the bottom at least, was running out of fuel and they could crash into the moon. Of course, they would have hit the launch on the upper part of the spacecraft to get back. But anyway, that's what Charlie Duke said. What does that look like? What does that look like? Does that look like a bag of garbage?
Bag of garbage.
That's what it is.
Yes.
That's what it is. It's a bag of garbage. The first thing the astronauts did, they opened the hatch and they threw out the garbage. So can you imagine if there was lunar police there and they were going to write a ticket and fine them in whatever lunar currency there was? But that was the first thing they did, was throw out the garbage. They littered. After a short 2.5-hour moonwalk, both astronauts came back on board. The module with 47 pounds of rock, they took off. Michael Collins remained in the command module, hurtling around the moon and preparing at an instant's notice to initiate one of 18 rescue procedures should something fail on the surface below. Now, Buzz Aldrin, you might remember this back in the day. There was Avis, the car rental company. And Avis did the commercial, "We try harder, we're number 2." And Hertz was number 1. Well, if you listen to Buzz Aldrin's story, that might be the same story. I have dealt with two astronauts in my life. One of them was him, Buzz Aldrin, who, yeah, he seemed to have a perpetual buzz about him, and the other was Thomas Stafford, who ended up being a general and said nothing. But Buzz, he could talk. Last time I saw him was around 2009. Remember Georgie Jessel? Remember the comedian Georgie Jessel? Remember he used to be the Toastmaster General of the United States and he'd have all those medals all over him? He looked like him that night. He had medals all over his jacket that night. Anyway, NASA's history website, Apollo Expeditions to the Moon, tells a slightly different version of the story. The agency originally predicted that Aldrin would be the first man to step on the moon, but the lunar module posed logistical challenges that made this order impossible. How many of you, when you get into a car, sit behind the steering wheel? How many of you drive the car? Okay. How many of you are passengers? Sit in the passenger seat.
Rarely.
But you do.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so suppose the car is like this. The driver, the door, the driver, and you have to climb in and climb over the driver. Well, this is the problem Buzz Aldrin is facing in the lunar module. The hatch opened on the opposite side where Aldrin was seated. For Aldrin to get out of it first, it would have been necessary for one bulky-suited, backpack astronaut to climb over another NASA rover. When that movement was tried, it damaged the lunar module mock-up that was tried on Earth. So he really couldn't do it. There's Armstrong's long shadow facing the lunar module. Aldrin made his case, though. He made his plea because he wanted to be the first on the moon, because unlike Armstrong, I think Aldrin would have milked it for all it was worth. Anyway, in all previous missions, this is what Aldrin stated: if someone, a crew member, was to spacewalk, it was always the junior person, not the space commander, who would stay inside. I felt there was an obligation on my part to put forth the reasons why the commander, who had been burdened down with an enormous amount of responsibility and training for activities, should stay inside. It's Donald Slate, Deke Slate. He was one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, but he never flew during the 1960s because he had a health problem. But he's the guy who's in charge of selecting the astronauts, and he would be the one who would select Neil Armstrong for Apollo 11. So Slayton's picked: Apollo 7, Wally Schirra, Don Isley, Walter Cunningham, Thomas Stafford, one of the 2 astronauts I've interviewed, John Young and Gene Cernan as a backup. That would be in October 1968. Apollo 8, Frank Borman. How many of you used to take Eastern Airlines? Eastern Airlines, well, he's the guy who literally ran it into the ground because somebody thought at Eastern, yeah, this is a great idea. Why don't we, as our CEO, pick an astronaut? They know about flying. They don't know anything about business. Jim Lovell. Jim Lovell played an astronaut in Apollo 13, the movie, and that older astronaut is talking to Jim Lovell, played by Tom Hanks in the movie Apollo 13, and Bill Anders, who passed away about a week ago. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Fred Hayes were the backup crew for that mission in December 1968. Apollo 9, James McDivitt, David Scott, Rusty Schweickart, Charles Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean. They're the backup March of 1968. And Apollo 10, Stafford, Young, and Serlin in May of 1968. So, that was in March of May of 1969. Sorry about that. Here's the crew. Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin. Slayton made a slight change because Michael Collins had come back from surgery and he demoted Fred Hayes. The success of Apollo 8 in December of 1968 meant it was time to name the crew of Apollo 11. Slayton had full confidence in the existing crews per rotation, both Armstrong and Conrad, and figured that there was no guarantee Apollo 11 would be the first landing on the moon, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's keep it the way it is. January 9th, 1969, Slayton makes his decision. Apollo 8's backup crew became the prime crew of Apollo 11. Collins comes back to work, and Slayton felt he deserved a spot. Now, let me ask you a question. You're Buzz Aldrin. You had been the command module pilot scheduled for this flight. But this guy, Collins, is back. So he's taking your slot, and they demote you to lunar module pilot. But if you're on the lunar module, you're going to walk on the moon. So is that a demotion or not?
No.
No.
No. So anyway, he had trained for his role before Apollo 8 and Apollo 9 were switched, so this made sense. The crew was not fully certain they would be the first on the moon. NASA had a tight sequencing of missions happening every few months, and all of those missions, their objectives, needed to be accomplished for each one to get Apollo 11 to the moon on time. Dick Hull, we'll get back to Dick Hull here. Dick told me that the space program, in order to get man on the moon by the end of 1969 to fulfill Kennedy's goal, they cut corners on everything imaginable. He also said it was amazing that they only lost 3 astronauts during that time. Considering how they overlooked safety hazards, overlooked all kinds of things to keep the schedule going. Apollo 11, that's the insignia, that's the Columbia and the Eagle. Armstrong took over the landing himself when he saw that the computer, by the way, this computer I have in my pocket is about 10,000 times more powerful than the computer that was on board with Neil Armstrong. So this thing is about 10,000 times more powerful. Anyway, he saw the computer was guiding them to a boulder-filled landing zone. Landing was achieved at 4:14 in the afternoon, Sunday afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, 2014 Greenwich Time, only 25 seconds of fuel left. Armstrong announced, Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed.
The Eagle has landed.
That was sent out to every federal employee. They were part of it, first day issue. Man could get to the moon, but let me explain a little bit about this envelope. It's sent to my father-in-law, Mr. Edwin Schaefer, Chief Architect, Federal Housing Administration, 2 Park Avenue, New York, New York. And here are the astronauts, there's a stamp. July 20th is the first stamp. It gets returned to Washington. Please note, new address, Federal Housing Administration, 3226 Federal Plaza, New York, New York. Sent back to Washington. The stamp there is in September. The final stamp is in November. They got to the moon, but they could not get that first day issue on time to my father-in-law, working for the federal government in a federal agency in New York City.
That's too funny.
You get to the moon, but you don't get your mail on time. Anyway, that's Lunar 16. And the Soviets were sending Lunar 15 to the moon at the same time that Armstrong and Collins and Aldrin were going. The Lunar 15 mission would orbit the moon at the same time as Apollo 11, and both would be transmitting radio signals to Earth. NASA enlisted Borman to get some intel on Lunar 15's flight plan. He had been friendly with some of the Soviet cosmonauts. The thing is that the astronauts and the cosmonauts didn't really care about the Cold War taking place at that time. Forget to ask you the question, was the space race about science or was it about military? What do you think? It was about military. It was about military. So anyway, he did get the info from the Soviets, and they said the radio signals would be no problem. Lunar 15 began circling the moon on July 17, 1969. If all went according to plan, the Soviet craft could be back on Earth with a container of lunar soil a day after Aldrin and Armstrong and Collins get back. Close enough to upstage the U.S. achievement. But if Apollo 11 totally fails, if it fails Apollo 11, the Soviets would get an outright triumph in the Cold War in the space race. But on July 21st, as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were preparing to lift off from the Sea of Tranquility, Lunar 15, while making its descent in the Sea of Creases, smashed into the mountain. The U.S. won the race. So how much were these guys paid for risking their lives? Well, Armstrong's salary was $27,401 a year. $235,000 today. Aldrin made $18,623, about $160,000 today, and Collins earned $17,148, about $148,000 today. Would you risk your life for $27,000, even if it's worth today $235,000?
Maybe.
Maybe,
Maybe.
maybe. Man's been dreaming of going to the moon forever. How many of you read H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds? First man in the moon, Dell novel. That was around the turn of the 20th century. This guy here is Robert Goddard. And by 1914, he had it all figured out. He knew exactly how to get to the moon, and he knew what rockets to go to the moon, even though there was no such thing as a rocket at that time.
Wow.
But he could figure it all out. He is considered, Dr. Robert Hutchins Goddard, the father of the modern rocket propulsion. Goddard had constructed and successfully tested the first rocket using liquid fuel on March 16, 1926, Auburn, Massachusetts. He gained his first public notice in 1907 in a cloud of smoke from a powder rocket fired in the basement of the Worcester Polytechnical Institute Physics Building in Massachusetts. 1914, he's got it all done. He's put the pencil to paper, and it's time to ask the U.S. Patent Office for a patent. And he gets 2 U.S. patents. One for a rocket using liquid fuel, and the other for a 2 or 3 stage rocket using solid fuel. He knew how to get to the moon in 1914. Think of that, 1914. It's 110 years later, but he knew how to get to the moon. And there he is with one of his rockets. Toward the end of his 1920 report, Goddard outlined the possibility of a rocket reaching the moon and exploding a large flash of powder there to mark its arrival. So you can see the powder. If you look, well, you're never going to see it. You're not going to see it. But then again, he never got a rocket to the moon. His rocket flight, 1929, he was not on. It was just a small rocket. Carried the first scientific payload, a barometer, and a camera. There is a very, very, very dark side to the space program, a very dark side. And this is the V-2 rocket. And about 15 years ago, I was at a facility in Glen Cove, about 15 years ago now, and there was a guy who was U.S. military. He was part of the White House detail for Kennedy and Johnson. And he was in Europe in the mid-1940s when this thing was fired. And he said this thing scared him. This thing really, really scared him. It was a rocket, and it was developed by the Germans. Goddard's work largely anticipated in technical detail the later German V-2 missiles, including the gyroscopic control, steering by means of vane and jet steering of the rocket motor, gimbal steering, power-driven fuel pumps, and other devices. The Americans and the Allies, they didn't come up with this. Of course, they were working on the atomic bomb at this point, but that's still a little whiles away where the Germans get this up and going in 1944. Launched from mobile units, each V-2 rocket was 46 feet high, carried a ton of explosives. First attack on London, England on September 8, 1944, gouged a 32-foot crater across, killed 3 people and injured 22. And there is the picture of the carnage afterwards. It took 5 minutes from launch to landing. Nobody was prepared for that. The V stood for, it sounds like something Mel Brooks would do for Springtime for Hitler. Vergeltungswaffen, or the retaliatory weapon, and was the last-ditch attempt by the Germans to reverse the course of the war. Do you know who worked building these? Do you know who worked on this, building this?
People in concentration.
People in concentration
Oh my
camps.
God.
People in concentration
Jesus.
camps. Prisoners, victims, whatever you want to call them, slave labor. Many pulled from concentration camps for their technical skills, such as welding, worked round the clock in an underground factory called Mittelwerk near the Buchenwald concentration camp in central Germany. These people lived under appalling conditions, and it was just as appalling in the factory. No daylight, little sleep, food, or proper sanitation. So let me ask you a question. Is there any way that sabotage could be committed? What do you think, yes or no? Germans have everything under control, right? So do you think it could be sabotaged, yes or no?
Yeah,
How?
that we don't have been asked you.
Many were executed for attempted sabotage. Eyewitness accounts describe prisoners being hanged from cranes above rocket assembly lines. Sabotage, urinate on the parts. It made the parts unusable.
Wow.
They urinated on the parts.
Oh
That
my
was the
God.
thing that they did, and it worked. It worked. Here is, as Dick Hull called him, our lovable Nazi, Werner von Braun. He is second from the right with the suit and the tie on, and he's showing off his rocket there, second on the right. Werner von Braun joined the Nazi Party on November 12, 1937. However, he claimed he was coerced by the SS, just following orders, He came from a politically connected family, and they had money. It's been documented that von Braun did not want his research used for military purposes. He even stated he was coerced into working with the Nazi Party. But all these guys are in uniform. But there's one guy who's not in uniform here, and that's our lovable Nazi, Werner von Braun. And this guy's getting some sort of medal, and this guy here, his name is Himmler.
That's
Heinrich Himmler, who was way up on the food chain. It was him, Goering, and then Hitler. That's where it was, him, Goering, and Goebbels. And he's there, he's smiling. So how coerced was he? The engineer who designed the V-2 was Werner von Braun. The Allies realized that the V-2 was a machine unlike anything they had developed themselves. When the war ended, the Americans, the Soviets, and the British scrambled to get their hands on the V-2 technology. Von Braun made a decision. He's going to surrender to Americans and roll the dice and see what happens. His brother also surrendered, and Dick Hull said he was a Nazi. He was a Nazi. He said Werner von Braun, he was reformed, but the other guy and a lot of the others, they were Nazis. Anyway, the Russians got their hands on the V-2 factory and the test range. Oh, here is our lovable Nazi again, second to the right. And to your left is our two astronauts, Wally Schirra and John Glenn. I got a question for you.
Wow.
What happened to all the Nazis? And how many Nazis were tried in Nuremberg?
Didn't some of them go to South America?
One Perón recruited them for Argentina.
Yeah.
So how many were at Nuremberg? About 24. So what happened to all the Nazis?
They just integrated
What
into a
happened to
lot
them?
of countries, right?
Well, yeah, they did. Operation Paperclip was an opportunity for the United States to utilize the mind power of some of the most brilliant minds that worked in Germany during World War II. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were taken from Germany to America, including Werner von Braun. Dick worked with these guys down in Huntsville, Alabama, and he said they did not want to learn English. They did not want to assimilate. They were still Nazis, and somehow they ended up in Huntsville, Alabama, which they didn't particularly appreciate. Cold War in space. The Cold War pitted the democratic capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union pitted against each other in the Cold War. Beginning in the late 1950s, space would become another arena for this competition as each side sought to prove its superiority of its technology, its military firepower, and by extension, its political economic system. For 15 years after World War II, von Braun worked with the U.S. Army in the development of ballistic missiles as part of a military operation called Project Paperclip. He and an initial group of about 125 were sent to America, where they were installed at Fort Bliss, Texas. They worked on rockets for the U.S. Army, assisted in V-2 launches at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico.
Wow.
1950, von Braun's team moved to the Redstone Arsenal near Huntsville, Alabama, where they designed the Army's Redstone, Jupiter ballistic missiles, as well as the Jupiter C, Juno 2, and Saturn I launch vehicles. Jupiter C was the first satellite that the U.S. orbited launched the first satellite orbited by the U.S., the Explorer 1, in 1958.
Can I just stop for a second?
Yeah.
So all these rockets can be used for so many things.
Yeah.
Weapons. Actually going to the moon.
Yeah.
And then what you just said there.
Yeah.
Was wild.
It was the Cold War. It wasn't a space exploration. Hey, look who's there to the left. You recognize that guy to the left?
Walt Disney.
Walt
Is
Disney.
he bad? He's kind of bad?
Yeah.
He's anti-Semitic.
Well, I don't know if he's anti-Semitic or not, but there are a lot of things in his background that
Okay.
he complained there was a strike at his studio in 1941, and he said they were communists who were striking.
Oh, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, among things. So why is our lovable Nazi with Walt Disney? Good thing. So do you know the history of Disneyland? Anybody know the history? Anybody been to Disneyland besides me? Yeah, you've been to Disney in California.
I've never been.
In California, not Florida. Well, I'm talking about just California.
Ah.
Just California. Here. It's the early 1950s. Disney is disgusted, absolutely disgusted with all the amusement parks, and there were a lot of them. There were a lot around here in New York. You had Freedom Land at one time, and you had two little amusement parks on Long Island. You still had Playland up there. Plenty of amusement parks in New Jersey. So there were a lot of them. They were all small, but there were a lot of them. So Disney took his daughters to these amusement parks. He didn't like the fact that they were dirty and that people running rides didn't have teeth. So he decides he is going to build his own amusement park 40 miles south of Los Angeles in the Orange Groves in Anaheim, California. And he's looking for help. He goes to CBS and Bill Paley, and they said, not interested, but if you ever do get it built, we might want to do shows out of there. He went to David Sarnoff over at NBC, same thing. Well, Paramount owned ABC TV. And ABC TV was a very, very weak network, only 14 stations, and they were fighting with Dumont for the bottom. Didn't bother with Dumont, Dumont had no money. But they were owned by Paramount, and Paramount Pictures and Paramount Studios and all that other stuff, although Paramount had to get rid of their movie theaters because of the 1947 Supreme Court ruling that if you owned the studio, you couldn't own the movie theater because you could keep other movie producers out of that theater. So anyway, so he meets with Leonard Goldensuit, and Golden said, yes, we're interested. We'll give you $4.5 million. Go ahead, knock yourself out and build it. It's a loan. We want the money back. We also want part of the concessions because we want to make a little money off it. But you have to also do another thing. We want 2 TV shows from you. One of the shows that we want from you is all about Disneyland. The other, we can't figure out how to compete with NBC and Howdy Doody. How many of you watched Howdy Doody back in the day? Can't compete with Howdy Doody. So can you come up with a show that will compete with Howdy Doody? You know what show we came up with?
Mickey
M-I-C-K-E-Y-M,
Mouse.
the Mickey Mouse Club.
Oh.
Quick, name me somebody, a Musketeer other than Annette.
Britney Spears.
No, the old one.
Oh.
The old one. There was Darla, there was Tommy, there was Cuppy, there was Don,
yeah,
and a
that
whole
whole
bunch of
song.
others. So yeah.
Was
So
there a name?
yeah. So anyway, so they cut the deal. So Disney gives them the Mickey Mouse Club, and there are 2 shows that made ABC profitable. One was the Mickey Mouse Club, and the other from Philadelphia in the afternoon with Dick Clark. How many of you ran home to watch Bandstand? No, you never did? You never were? Oh, you were working at the time. Did you run home to watch Bandstand? Anyway, and that made ABC profitable. So the story is, of course, what's the other show? Well, the other show is all about Disneyland. Von Braun was one of the most prominent advocates for space exploration in the United States during the 1950s, writing numerous books, several articles for magazines such as Collier's. Von Braun also served as a spokesman for 3 Walt Disney television programs on space travel, Man in Space. Now, if you put Disney and Von Braun together with space exploration, what's your target audience? Kids. Kids. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be an astronaut. You're not going at, well, you are going after the parents, but the parents, of course, will listen to the kids. You're not going after the grandparents and the great-grandparents. But with that, he goes on and he hosts 3 TV shows in space. This is Sputnik. I am a little too young to remember Sputnik. I was only a year and a half when it went up in October 1957. Anybody remember it going up? You do. Were you afraid of it? No, you weren't afraid of it. And one guy who told me he wasn't afraid of Sputnik, but he was afraid of the delivery system, the intercontinental ballistic missile, that it could hit New York within 10 minutes where he was living, and that was something that really bothered him. On October 4th, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, Russian for traveler, the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. Sputnik was an aluminum beach ball size object, and it was stuffed with about 180 pounds worth of equipment, 4 spindly legs. It careened through space for about 3 months, circling the Earth every 100 minutes, and then we go beep, 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 beep. And some people in the rock and roll industry, and they had no idea what was going on with the rock and roll industry, particularly in '58, because Elvis was in the Army, and Little Richard went to Bible school, and Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin. So there were some problems in rock and roll. So hey, why don't we do songs about space like the Purple People Eater? Remember that song? Or Beep Beep Beep, get that involved in songs. Oh, let me ask you a question. Was the United States Department of Defense upset that the Russians got to space first? Yes or no?
Of course.
The answer is no.
Really?
No. In fact, they were happy because all of a sudden, hey, they got into space first. Money, money, money's coming in. Money, money, money. We got to catch up to them. And money came into the Defense Department. Also, money went into education. Not necessarily for English or social studies teachers, but for math teachers and science teachers. In fact, last week, a woman who's been retired for quite a while, was teaching back in the 60s, said she never understood why we had so many math teachers, why we had so many science teachers, and not that many English teachers. And I explained to her, they put the money in because they wanted kids to take math and science. So they were happy as well. The American satellite was eventually launched from Cape Canaveral, and the Americans would, of course, recover from the Soviets' early lead into space. Nobody in here knows who this guy is. Bill Cleary. 2 weeks ago, I was down in Middletown, New Jersey, at a community college doing a lifelong learning talk. And I put this picture up, and I said, anybody know who it is? And these 2 people in the back said, we do, we do. I said, hey, you know Bill Cleary? He was the coach at Harvard, they said. I said, oh, you know your hockey then. And the guy said, well, my wife was an administrative assistant, student, for the Cornell hockey team, so we used to work with Bill Cleary when Harvard came in with logistics and all that other stuff. Well, it's 1995, and I am at Rockefeller Center, and I am working for Westwood One Radio at the time. And the United States Olympic team is honoring 2 hockey teams. The 1960 gold medal winning hockey team, the team that beat Czechoslovakia in Squaw Valley in California, and also the 1980 Olympic hockey team, the team that beat Russia, but they didn't beat Russia to win the gold medal, they beat Finland to win the gold medal. Although people forget about that, the United States beat the Soviets at the height of the Cold War in Afghanistan in 1980. So I'm talking to Cleary about the 1960 team, and he says to me, did you ever hear of our adventures in Moscow in 1958? I said, I don't know anything about it. He says, okay, let me tell you. and he begins to tell me. He says, Dwight Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev are looking to poke holes in the Cold War. And the bureaucrats come up with, why don't we try a cultural exchange? Soviets would send the Bolshoi Ballet. Anybody see that ballet company? You have. Are they good? I've never seen them. Yeah, you didn't care for it. They're supposedly really good. And they also sent the Moscow Circus, complete with the dancing bears. I love watching Ed Sullivan with the dancing bears. Now, my cousin was Jerry Stiller. I guess my cousin is Ben Stiller, who happened to be a great uncle of mine, who Ben is named after the great uncle of mine in Brooklyn, and that's a story in
I
itself.
see your family tree.
Yeah.
So, well, on the other side, Stella Adler, who taught Marlon Brando and also Robert De Niro how to act. So I guess that's why I'm comfortable standing in front of people. First, they were the first family to the Yiddish Theater on 2nd Avenue. And also another aunt was Bella Abzug's chief of staff. So, well, I'm not sure about that. You got to, if you dealt with these people. You eat with these people? Anyway. So it's Bill Cleary. So he says, we get together in Boston. Oh, by the way, Jerry told me, I asked him about a whole bunch of things about Sullivan, because he and Ann, who I loved Ann Muir, she's great. They were on Sullivan 36 times. He said, Sullivan would do anything for a buck. Even if Mao Zedong wanted to give a speech for 42 minutes on Sullivan's show and he could make money off of it, he would have given that airtime to Mao Zedong. Anyway, so Cleary says, he says, well, this is his story. We all gather in Boston, we're going to Massachusetts. A bunch of us are college students, some of us are firemen, we have other occupations. There's only one guy who's going to turn pro, it's Tommy Williams. And so they get on the plane and they go to Moscow. Anybody here been to Russia besides me? You have. And she has. You notice a lot of those buildings are painted drab gray. They were drab gray. The reason why they're drab gray is that it's the only color they had. And well, you go up to Ottawa, to the Russian embassy, or past the Russian embassy, all the other embassies are elegant looking. Russia is at the end of the trail, in the woods. It's gray with barbed wire all around it. You can't miss it. So anyway, so they fly in, and they go to the hotel, one of the best hotels in Moscow, and they're going to be honored that night at a banquet. So they get into the room and they start looking at the wires to see if there are any bugs, and there's a potted plant back here, so I'll bring the potted plant up. So they would look at the potted plant, and they'd go through the potted plant to see if there were any bugs in there, because they were worried that they were going to be bugged. So anyway, to make a long story short, so they leave their rooms, they go down to the banquet room where they're being honored, and there's the big banquet, and they're all ushered in there, and they get to their place to eat, and you got the plate, and you got another plate, and you got the soup plate with the napkin and the soup plate, you got the knives here, the forks there, the spoons here, the bread plate is here with the bread, you got your wine glass there, you got your water glass there, and they sit down, and the waiter pulls the napkin, and what is revealed is this: there's a miniature Sputnik in there. It's intimidation. They are trying to intimidate the Americans because the U.S. was having trouble launching satellites. I asked Cleary, I said, did you take the Sputnik as a souvenir? He said, no, I did not want to go to the Gulag. Laka the dog. Soviets had 36 dogs. 36 dogs that they were considering sending into space, and she drew the short straw. Although the USSR long insisted that Latka expired painlessly after about a week in orbit, an official with the Moscow Institute for Biological Problems leaked the true story in 2002. She died within a few hours of takeoff from panic and overheating, according to the BBC. Sputnik 2 continued to orbit the Earth for 5 months, then burnt up when it re-entered the atmosphere April 1958. This is the Vanguard. This is the answer to Sputnik, except that goes up and comes right back down, a spectacular explosion. Cool to watch as long as nobody is there, and nobody was there, but it was an unmitigated disaster. The U.S. response was to accelerate the Vanguard program, a joint National Academy of Sciences U.S. Naval Research Laboratory project, which unfortunately resulted in the spectacular and embarrassing, my old friend Cosell, launch failure of the Vanguard TB3 on December 6th. By that time, the Soviets had already achieved their second success with Sputnik 2. This is the satellite that does succeed. It's January 31st, 1958. It's the Explorer 1, and America is finally in space. In 1958, the U.S. launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by our lovable Nazi, U.S. Army under the direction of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. Same year, Dwight Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. That is Lunar 2, and the Soviets would get another leg up on the Americans in Lunar 2. September 12, 1959, the Soviet space program took another step forward with the launch of Lunar 2, first space probe to hit the moon. Well, it's time to hire astronauts. So what do you look for in an astronaut? Suppose you are placing an ad in the New York Times Help Wanted section. Remember when the New York Times Help Wanted section was about that thick?
Oh, yeah.
Craig Newmark, Craigslist. Do you know Craigslist?
Yeah.
Well, Craig Newmark's mother used to come to my talks in New Jersey. It's about 15 years ago. And one day, she introduced herself to me. She said, "Do you know who my son is?" I said, "No." She said, "He's Craig Newmark. He came up with Craigslist." And I said to him, your son's the one who destroyed the newspapers. And she said, "You're right." I said, "Do you ever feel bad about it?" He said, "No. They had the opportunity to do it. It was there. I took it. They could have done the same thing." And with that, he destroyed, although the internet was going to really destroy newspapers. I had once worked for the Bergen Record in Hackensack. I worked there 3 times, as a matter of fact, over the years, doing op-ed pieces and other things. And they're in they are in Hackensack, right next to Perens, all that shopping. The salespeople there never had to go out. All the stores would just come in, we want to buy this. But with the internet, they didn't have to anymore. They had their own websites. So anyway, so you're a human resource person. You're going to hire an astronaut. What do you look for in an astronaut?
Flying skills.
Okay, there's one. Craziness, daredevil, maybe somebody shot out of a cannon, maybe
Military
somebody,
background?
eventually. But they considered other things.
Wow.
It's Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, Donald Deke Slayton, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, and Gordon Cooper. It was April 9th, 1959. They were formally introduced, and they became stars. They're on the cover of, remember Life magazine?
Yeah.
The original Life magazine that printed weekly. September 14th, 1959, they're on the cover of Life magazine, and their wives. Astronaut wives, they're in their thoughts, worries. Well, that was all made up, because the real books that came out years later talked about alcoholism and adultery and all this other stuff, but it's 1959, so they're not going to talk about that. No one knew the right criteria for selecting people who would travel into the unknown realm of outer space. When choosing who would make the best astronauts, several high-risk professions were considered before it was decided. We have a military filled with pilots, let's use the military. So they got the active test pilots. They also were looking for monkeys. Monkeys, and that's Miss Baker, the monkey. Not the monkeys that were on TV 10 years later. How many of you watched the Monkeys? Did you watch the Monkeys? Oh yeah, who's your favorite monkey?
Mickey Dolenz.
Mickey.
The monkey.
Yeah, he was your favorite. All right, because most people tell me Davy. Davy. Anyway, May 28, 1959, Abel and Baker were shot about 360 miles up into space, experienced about 9 minutes of weightlessness, the same thing that William Shatner did about 2 years ago at the age of 90. Captain Kirk got into space. Their safe return made them huge celebrities. The monkeys appeared on the cover of Life magazine, and at a press conference, news correspondents pushed each other, and clamored over chairs to get closer, reported the New York Times. The newspaper also noted the monkeys were far less excited than the humans. They munched on peanuts and crackers. They worked cheap. Miss Abel died 4 days after the flight because they pulled the electrodes out of her head, and that was the end of her. But she was a hero. And there's
The
Ham.
monkey.
He's 2 years old. He's a chimpanzee. He's going into space. Beginning in July 1959, 2-year-old Ham, the chimpanzee, was trained to do simple time tests in response to electric lights and sounds. During his pre-flight training, Ham was taught to push a lever within 5 seconds of seeing a flashing blue light. Sounds a lot like Good Golly Miss Molly dancing by a house of blue light. Right? Those are the lyrics.
Yep.
Sounds just like that. Maybe that's where they got the idea, dancing in a house of blue light. The failure to do so resulted in the application of a mild electric shock to the soles of his feet. How did they know it was mild? Anyway, but this monkey also worked cheaply because a correct response earned him a banana pellet. Ham was not merely a passenger, and the results of the test flight led directly to the mission Alan Shepard made on May 5th, 1961, aboard Freedom 7. Why is this chimp laughing? Why is this chimp laughing? He survived. San Francisco Examiner headline, Space Chimp Lives. By the way, San Francisco Examiner, I wrote some op-ed pieces for them in 2001. Are you familiar with Casey at the Bat? The poem, Casey at the Bat, was written by Ernest Thayer in 1888 for this newspaper. He got $5 for it. I got $100 for whatever I did. I did the mathematics, what was $5 worth in 2001. I didn't get as much money as Thayer.
What's it mean?
Ham got banana pellets. Dwight Eisenhower, and our favorite Nazi again, getting another medal. In 1960, Eisenhower transferred his Rocket Development Center at the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, from the Army to the newly established National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Primary object, develop that giant Saturn rocket, the one that Goddard had in mind back in 1914. Mr. President, it's there. You sure, Werner? Yeah, it's there. There's the moon. That's the moon. You want to go to the moon? There's Kennedy, von Braun, and the rocket.
Oh.
Von Braun became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He was the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle, the super booster that would propel Americans to the moon. And that is von Braun's rocket, the Redstone rocket that is going up. That's mine. Don't worry about that. I should have silenced it, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, so that's the rocket that carried Alan Shepard into suborbital space. But the Americans fail again, because Yuri Gagarin is the first guy into space, Soviet cosmonaut, on April 12, 1961. He's on the Vostok 1. The Americans would also fail in 1962. The Russians sent a woman, Tereshkova, into space, and the Americans only had men who were in the astronaut program. So there's Alan Shepard, and he's ready to go. At Marshall, the group continued to work on the Redstone Mercury, the rocket that sent the first American astronaut, Alan Shepard, on the suborbital flight May 5th, 1961. And there he is on May 5th, 1961. Welcome back. After 15 minutes in space, there he goes. How many of you saw Hidden Figures? The movie.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that show was wonderful.
Wonderful movie. Dick and I were talking about Hidden Figures. And I said, how much of that movie was true? He said, most of it. A good lot of it. He said they didn't make things up. And they didn't. Katherine Johnson is there, the most brilliant person who worked at NASA. Now, what Dick told me was this. These people were not hidden. Everybody knew who they were.
Oh.
Jim Crow America. three smartest people are African American women. It's bad enough they're women. On top of it, it's African American women. I asked him about the scene where the woman, one of the women has to go to the restroom and has to go across the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the rain to go to the bathroom. He said that happened.
No, that's not
That
right.
happened. This is John Glenn, and this is February 20th, 1962. And the Mercury astronaut John Glenn asked engineers to get the girl, Katherine Johnson, to run the same numbers through the equations that had been programmed into the computer, but by hand, on her desktop mechanical calculating machine. If she says they're good, Katherine Johnson remembers the astronaut saying, then I'm ready to go. This woman was absolutely brilliant, absolutely brilliant. By hand, she helped sync Project Apollo's lunar lander with the Moon Orbiting Command and Service Module, and that would be used to land on the moon. She retired after 33 years at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia in 1986. Mary Jackson was another of the hidden figures. And why were they hidden? They were hidden from America. They weren't hidden there. Everybody knew who they were, but they were hidden from America. And they were all hidden from the big, big brass there because they didn't want them to know. Dorothy Vaughan, that was the other. Anyway, their goals, the Mercury goals, were pretty simple. 7 astronauts, although Deke Slayton didn't fly because he had a health issue. So there were 6 missions. Planned place a manned space flight in orbit around the Earth. That was done with John Glenn. Investigate man's performance capabilities and his ability to function in the environment of space. Gordon Cooper was up for 1 day. Recover the man and spacecraft safely. They almost didn't with Gus Grissom. The capsule was lost, and Grissom almost drowns. It's July 21st, 1961, and Gus Grissom flew the second NASA Mercury Redstone mission. But that trip nearly ended, or nearly identical to Shepard, but nearly ended in disaster. Grissom's capsule, the Liberty 7, sank after the successful splashdown in the Atlantic, and Grissom came close to drowning. Gemini program, that's Richard Gordon's spacewalk. He was the second guy to do that. And here's a question for you. Anybody here National Football League fans? You are. What team?
Jets.
J-E-T-S, Jets.
But I like all kinds of teams.
You like all kinds
Because I'm a
of
Jets
teams.
fan.
Because you're a Jets fan and you never see them win. So, anyway, you're a Jets fan? Condolences. I interviewed Joe Namath. In fact, I have a picture of Joe Namath that I have showed here. I've showed here at one of the talks. Anyway, somebody in New Orleans, the owner of the New Orleans Saints football team, decided that it would be a good idea to hire an astronaut, Dick Gordon, to run his football team. And the results were predictable. The team was lousy. And he got fired.
Come on, that's the end. That's the end.
But he was a spacewalker. Gemini had 4 goals: test an astronaut's ability to fly long-duration missions up to 2 weeks in space, to understand how spacecraft could rendezvous and dock in orbit around the Earth and the Moon, to perfect re-entry and landing methods, and to further understand the effects of longer space flights on astronauts. Borman and Lovell went for 14 days. And 2 spacecraft meet, the Gemini and 6 and 7 missions. Gemini program, 19 launches, 2 initial uncrewed test missions, 7 target vehicles, 10 crewed missions, each carrying 2 astronauts to Earth orbit. And it was a bridge program between Mercury and Apollo, 1962 to 1966. Well, Dick told me that you cannot discount the unmanned flights. You cannot discount them. There were 3 series of unmanned flights to the moon. Most of them ended up in failure, total failure. The Pioneer program, Pioneer 0, 1, 2, first lunar attempts, they all failed. Followed by 3 and 4, and Pioneer 4 succeeded in becoming America's first successful lunar mission. Ranger 7. For Ranger 7, there were 7 of them, and 6 of them failed. It was a program of unmanned space missions whose objective was to obtain the first close-up images of the surface of the moon The Ranger spacecraft was designed to take images of the lunar surface, transmitting those images to Earth until the spacecraft was destroyed upon impact. A series of mishaps led to the failure of the first 6 flights, but July 64, Ranger 7 was successful. And then there was the Surveyor program, and this was highly successful. The missions between May 1966 and January 1968, Surveyor 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7 successfully soft landed on the lunar surface. Iceland, my friend Orly.
That's you.
Yeah, it's me in the middle, and that's Orly's father. I was speaking on a celebrity cruise ship. This is back 6 years ago now, in May of 1960. Yeah, it was May of 1968. 68. May of, I was thinking of something else. May of 2018. Anyway, Orly was a model. He wore an astronaut suit, and he was in an airline's campaign, advertising campaign. And he got to be really interested in the space program. In fact, on that voyage that we were on, he gave a talk in the spacesuit. So why was he so into the space program? What happened? Well, Iceland. The astronauts went to Iceland. Why did they go to Iceland? No. Training. Volcanic rocks. Lava. It was the nearest thing on Earth that they could find to the moon. And there is his museum. It's called the Exploration Museum, Museum of Science and Exploration at the edge of the Arctic. And the people there in the middle of the picture, Neil Armstrong's family. And this is Orly's museum. In 2015, Orly led an expedition with Apollo astronauts Walter Cunningham and Rusty Schweickart and Harrison Schmitt, as well as the family of Neil Armstrong, to the new lava of Holornran, created by fissure eruptions in 2014 and 2015. And there are 2 astronauts, or former astronauts, going back to where they were in 1965. This is the 50th anniversary, or 1967. Orly told me, Neil Armstrong's family told him he was supposed to be working, but he spent most of his time fishing and drinking beer. That's what he was doing. And there's the bus that Orly rented, and they went up to the lava fields, and there were former astronauts and astronauts' families on there. And they had a good old time in Iceland, thanks to Orly. Orly led similar expeditions with Apollo astronauts Bill Anders and Charlie Duke to areas near Askja, Cauldron, situated in the remote part of the central highlands of Iceland, where the astronauts trained in geology in 1965 and 1967 before the lunar missions. That's if they wanted to work hard. The program is almost derailed on January 27, 1967. There's a fire, and it kills Gus Grissom, Ed White, and the 32-year-old Roger Chafee. And Dick Hull is working the flight. And Dick Hull said that the last 45 seconds of this guy's life, of these guys' lives, you don't want to hear. Dick said it was never made public, and rightfully so. But what it was, he said, the guys are talking normally, and all of a sudden a fire breaks out in the capsule. And they yell fire and start screaming because they are marooned. There is nothing they can do. And they're screaming and screaming, and all of a sudden there's gurgling and nothing. They were all dead within 45 seconds. Apollo 1 was supposed to be the first low Earth orbital test of the Apollo 1 command and service module with a crew, and was supposed to go up February 21st, 1967. There was a cabin fire, killed the 3 astronauts, destroyed the capsule. To make the test as flight-like as possible, the door to the spacecraft had been sealed, and the capsule's interior had been filled with pure oxygen. These high concentrations of oxygen fanned the flames, making it all too easy for a spark to grow into an inferno. The vehicle's hatch was designed to open inwards. It would take 90 seconds. These guys had 5 seconds. They had no chance. As the flames engulfed the spacecraft, the searing heat inside the capsule caused the air pressure to rise, which in turn made it impossible for the astronauts to open the hatch. After they got the astronauts out, this is what it looked like. After about 30 seconds, the spacecraft ruptured. And despite the ground crew's valiant attempt to rescue the trapped astronauts, all 3 men died of asphyxiation in less than a minute, about 45 seconds. Manned flights were suspended for 21 months. The cause of the accident was investigated, and improvements to the spacecraft and safety procedures were made, and unmanned test flights of the Saturn V rocket and the Apollo lunar module continued. Now, Dick said, didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what happened to that rocket. Pure oxygen, a spark, wires exposed, corners cut, all kind of corners cut, bad design. You know, it was inevitable. It was inevitable. They had not lost anybody until then. That was the first time that they had lost astronauts in training. Although they lost 2 guys in a plane crash. There is Apollo 1. This is what it looked like after it cooled down and they were able to get a look at it. The fire threw everything for a loop. Not only was NASA dealing with a loss of crew, but the command module needed significant redesigns. Michael Collins, who went in Apollo 11, said, without Apollo 1 and the lessons learned from it, in all probability, such a fire would have taken place later in the flight. And not only the crew, but the entire spacecraft would have been lost. And NASA, with no machinery to examine, could only guess at the causes and how to prevent still another occurrence. Yes, Apollo 1 did cause 3 deaths, but I believe it did save more than 3 later. Well, here's the crew of Apollo 7. And that looks really 1960s. That really looks 1960s. Anyway, Wally Schirra, Don Isley, who is kneeling, and Walter Cunningham. There were arguments over whether to launch or not. Conflicts over television broadcasts. How many of you drank Tang?
I drank Tang.
What'd you think?
It's okay.
Wasn't too enthusiastic.
I just like orange sugar.
That's
Water,
what it
right?
really was. Orange
Yeah.
sugar is orange powder. And if you had to go to the bathroom, you better know 30 minutes in advance you have to go to the bathroom because it took that long to take off the spacesuit. Wally Schirra was 45 years old. He was a Mercury and Gemini astronaut, a Navy test pilot. And he was at the center of the disputes. Isley and Cunningham were on the mission as well, but it succeeded. Launched on October 11th, 1968. Everything that Apollo 1 was supposed to do, it did. It worked. Earthrise. Before 1968, you never saw this picture. You never saw this picture from Bill Anders' camera. We choose to go to the moon, JFK. His goal of May 25th, 1961, get to the moon by the end of the decade. And there is Borman and Anders and Tom Hanks, Jim Lovell. This is the Bethpage Library. Anybody from Long Island here?
Used to be.
Used to be, where?
I lived in Belmore.
Belmore. I am going out to Belmore on August 25th to give a talk at the library in the afternoon on August 25th. I have no idea what I'm talking about. We'll figure that out when I get. I know what I'm supposed to be talking about.
Unrelated, you said something about Eisenhower?
Eisenhower.
Being a
Yeah.
Nazi?
No, that was Von Braun.
That was what?
Von Braun being our lovable Nazi.
It's like right in there, yes.
Anyway, this is the lunar module.
At the Bethpage
And
Library.
at the Bethpage Library. Grumman, which built it, used to be huge there, not anymore, gave what was in their lobby to the library. So you walk in near the checkout desk, and there is the big mock-up. That's pretty big of the lunar module, and through those doors on the right is where I get to speak. The Apollo 8 mission was changed in August of '68, a more ambitious command module-only lunar flight, orbital flight, to be flown in December. The lunar module is probably stuck on the Long Island Expressway, or the Northern State, or the Southern State. I've got the whole world in my hands. Remember Mahalia Jackson?
Yeah.
Mahalia Jackson had the whole world in her hands. Well, Bill Anders took this picture of the whole world in his hands. Apollo 8 circled the moon on Christmas Eve, 1968. Borman, Lovell, and Anders read passages from the Bible, Genesis, the earth is good, don't mess with it. Vietnam War is taking place at that time. In 1968, Robert Kennedy assassination. Martin Luther King assassination, Chicago Democratic Convention, and all the other things that went on during 1968. Dick Holt told me that of all the flights he was involved with between 1960 and 1975, this particular flight got more fan mail than any other. The lunar module does debut in March of 1969 on Apollo 9. The commander, James McDivitt, the command module pilot, David Scott, lunar module pilot, Rusty Schweiker, spent 10 days in low Earth orbit, testing out all of these things that you need to do to get to the moon, including the lunar module engines, backpack life supports, navigation systems, and docking maneuvering. Interviewed Thomas Stafford once. He was the commander on this mission, Apollo 10. And this is the dress rehearsal. Apollo 10, at the height of Peanuts, Charlie Brown and Snoopy, at the absolute height of this was after the Charlie Brown Christmas that was on every year. Anyway, Charlie Brown and Snoopy launched on May 18, 1969. Dress rehearsal, everything short of landing. They get within 8.4 nautical miles of the surface of the moon, fire up their engines, go back to the command module, and it is ready for showtime. And you are ready for this guy, Dick Hull. Dick Hull's my friend. He's about 90 years old now, and he is not giving talks about NASA anymore, which is why I got a lot of the information, because he's 90 and doesn't want to give any talks, and he has some health issues anyway. But Dick was in Australia, tracking station in Australia. And he's the guy who's going to bring the video down from the moon, reroute it, and show it to about 400 million people around the world. It's about a minute and a half before showtime, and Dick turns on the camera, and he gets this image. Not Armstrong, just the ladder. It's upside down, which means that Armstrong would be going up your screen instead of down your screen if you watched it. How many of you watched the lunar landing back then?
A lot of people.
A lot of people. 53 million Americans.
When they landed on the moon.
53 million Americans watched it, 600 million around the world. But, okay, let's go back to July 20th, 1969. If you saw a picture upside down, would you think they were on the moon? Or on a Hollywood stage?
Oh, do you think
Okay.
they did that on purpose?
No, this is what happened. So it's about a minute 20 left to showtime. Dick sees this picture and he tells his boss, "That's okay, we'll fix it. Just put a mirror underneath it, we'll write the image, no problem." His boss says, "If you do that, I'm going to fire you on the spot." Dick says, "You do that, you're going to be the laughing stock before 400 million people." So, clock is ticking down, 55 seconds, don't know what to do. 50, 45, 40. Oh, wait, we have a new system here. Wait, I wonder if they flipped the switch to on. 13 seconds left, flips the switch. You got to see the picture. Now, you can't repeat that to anybody. You're not allowed to tell that to your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, friends. You can't say that. But if you do, you didn't hear it from me. You did not hear it from me. I don't know where you heard it from, but you didn't hear it from me. That's right. Billions of dollars. You finally get there. And billions of dollars are spent. I want my MTV.
Let's go in there.
I want my MTV. All of that money for a TV commercial in 1981. There you go. I want my MTV. You have to be of a certain age to appreciate this cartoon that was in the newspapers. Alice Cramden. The two astronauts are strolling on the moon and they come across the body of Alice Cramden. And they say, "It's Alice Cramden." Now you know what that's from, right? The Honeymooners. Honeymooners, Jackie Gleason, Ralph Cramden. One of these days, Alice, one of these days, bang, zoom to the moon.
Ah, I get it.
Alice Cramden. See, you got to be of a certain age. From Bill Safire, Nixon's speechwriter, to H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff, in the event of moon disaster. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These
Wow.
brave men, Neil Armstrong and
Had
Buzz,
it already written.
Buzz Aldrin, it was all written on July 18th. Nixon, I dealt with Nixon. Please call me Dick. Nixon praised the moon landing in the speech, but there was another speech prepared. Discovered in the archives of Nixon administration's archives by the historian James Mann in 1999. The speech was composed by the speechwriter William Safire to be used in the event of a disaster that would maroon the astronauts on the moon. Well, the heyday is just about gone. November 14th, the Apollo 12 mission. Pete Conrad, our NFL general manager, after he retires, Dick Gordon and Alan Bean. Apollo 12 was struck by lightning twice, the first minute of the flight, but went on to perform the second successful human landing on the moon. The commander was Charles Pete Conrad, lunar commander Alan Bean. They landed the lunar module Intrepid in the ocean of storms, 535 feet away from the robotic Surveyor 3 lander. Richard Gordon was piloting the command capsule. And there they're checking out the old equipment on the moon. The Apollo program would continue through 1972. 6 missions would be successful. Apollo 13 never made it to the moon because of an onboard explosion, but it was one hell of a movie that won Ron Howard an Academy Award, and I think Tom Hanks won an Academy Award for playing Jim Lovell. And Jim Lovell's in the movie talking to a younger Jim Lovell, played by Tom Hanks. Now, Dick said something to me about the space program, space exploration. No Bucks, no Buck Rogers. How many of you watched the Buck Rogers serials in the movies? You got your 2 cartoons, you got your serial, you got your newsreel, you got your sports reel, you got 2 features, and it was all for what, a dime?
Used to watch it on TV.
Oh, you watched it on TV. But if you went to the movies, it was about a dime. Although some woman told me in the Bronx it was 15 cents. 15 cents. I said, well, you had the money in the Bronx. You lived on the concourse. She said,
I went to Webster Avenue.
oh, Webster Avenue? Well, you weren't living on the concourse, were you? No, see, they
I
had...
worked on the concourse, the phone building up there.
Yeah. So anyway, no Bucks, no Buck Rogers. In March of 1970, less than a year after the first landing, President Richard Nixon signed a directive making space just another program that would compete for funding. Interest dwindled. And you know how they knew interest dwindled? Television. The TV ratings sunk. And that sunk the Apollo program. The last flight was in December 1972. The last man to walk on the moon was Gene Cernan, and he left the moon on December 14th, 1972. There are plans to land people on the moon in 2026. The next visit by humans to the moon will be, if all goes well, September 2025, with the Artemis capsule flying around the moon, and then Artemis 3 will land 4 astronauts. All goes according to plan, South Pole of the moon, sometime in 2026. Any questions, any comments? It's your turn.
Oh, there's so much, I know.
It's your turn. Your turn to talk.
I'm just still amazed because you spent
I'm just putting
Sure.
this stuff here.
a lot of time on it. The Van Buren, what was his name again?
Von Braun.